Okay, this is going to be my notes and reflections on Chapter 12 of B.J. Penn's autobiographical book, Why I Fight. I've been going through the book, recording, videotaping my notes instead of writing them in the margins or writing them elsewhere or just highlighting or what have you as an experiment. Chapter 12 is entitled Defense, and in Chapter 11, where that closed off, he had just beat Matt Hughes for the welterweight world championship title. Before Hughes, he had also fought what was his name, Gomi or something like this, in Hawaii, who was pretty much recognized as the best lightweight in the world prior to the fight. So he was standing, basically at the top of the lightweight and welterweight divisions. And so going into Chapter 12, he's looking at what to do next. And some guys from K1, which is another organization from another fighting organization from Japan, and the guy's name was Takano, who approached them, wanted to make BJ an offer to come and fight in Japan. And in fact, the offer that he made was pretty lucrative, close to $200,000 per fight if he agreed to fight in K1. This was interesting to BJ because he basically already, like the UFC had eliminated the lightweight division at that time, and so he didn't have that anymore there. He was already at the top of the welterweight, and the UFC was having a difficult time finding other people or bringing in other people for him to fight. I mean, he had suggested some of the fighters that were from Japan as potential candidates for him to fight against, but the UFC wasn't interested in recruiting them. And so, BJ, his whole interest is in fighting the best. The idea of going to do, some fights in K1 was of interest to him. He didn't want to leave the UFC or anything like that, but he knew there were some good fighters in K1, and he could get involved in that organization and have some good fights against them. In fact, one of the guys that he wanted to fight right away was this Ludwig. Ludwig had knocked out Pulver. Pulver had been the guy who last held the lightweight world championship belt in the UFC before the lightweight division was eliminated. So, and Pulver had beaten BJ, but BJ always, wanted to get back with Pulver. Pulver was not easy to get a fight with because he was really more interested in negotiating for the money and such, in a way that pretty much eliminated him from being able to fight. So the next best thing would be for BJ to fight the guy who had knocked out Pulver. I mean, already the guy had knocked out Pulver, so why even bother with Pulver? Go for the guy that had knocked him out, and that's the Ludwig, and he was fighting in K1. Meanwhile, also, his contract had run out with the UFC, so he was renegotiating his contract with them. And in fact, as they went into negotiations and stuff, a lawyer in Hilo had noticed that his contract with the UFC had actually run out before the Matt Hughes fight. And so he really wasn't under contract for the Matt Hughes fight, legally, because the contract that he had stated, 3 fights or a 1-year term from the start of the first fight, which was with Matt Serra for that contract, whichever came first. And what came first was the year ran out before he went into the fight with Matt Hughes about 4 months before. So the Matt Hughes fight was really outside of the whole contract, and if BJ had known beforehand, he might have been able to negotiate that fight for a little bit more money. But he took it for what the original contract was worth, and that's, I think that's actually the more honest way to go anyway, instead of being so money focused. But he has to look out for himself. And so he goes into contract negotiations, and the UFC is offering him piddly little pay. Now he's the welterweight champion, and really he's the lightweight champion, although it's not official. There's no lightweight division anymore, but they don't even offer him on this new contract as much as Matt Hughes, who he beat, is getting paid. And so, this is not good, right? So, and regardless, it is like a ton less money than what K1 is offering him just to do a single fight. I mean, his whole contract with the UFC might not add up, if he doesn't win the fights, might not add up to what he's going to get paid, win or lose, in a single K1 fight. So, he's really got some thinking to do about whether or not he wants to contract with the UFC again. But he does hold the welterweight belt, and eventually he decides to take the fight with Ludwig with K1. And when he does this, of course, the UFC gets really upset, and Dana White calls him and cusses him out and stuff. And BJ tells him, truthfully, it doesn't have to be like that. The UFC could easily offer him the decent money and find him the good fights, and then he wouldn't have to even be with the K1, or they could just let him fight in the K1 while they found him the other fights in the UFC, and don't worry about it. BJ was about fighting the best people, and he's got to look out for himself, and that's part of the package. Like when the UFC pays these fighters scrub money, one of the ways that they excuse that is that they say, well, they are helping to promote that fighter, and so they kind of like make it like that fighter is supposed to be their own business anyway. And yet here, when a fighter acts like he is his own business and wants to take his fight, take another fight over here, even though he doesn't want to leave your organization, he doesn't want to leave the UFC, he just wants to take another fight over here, then the UFC gets all upset. So anyway, so BJ goes to Japan to fight in K1. Fights Ludwig, submits him by triangle choke very quickly, and that's that. His next fight is back in Hawaii again with his brother JD's Rumble on the Rocks, and that fight was with what's his name? I think his name is like Rodriguez Gracie. He's a member of the Gracie family in any case. Let me just make sure, because I don't want to like get it completely wrong. But yeah, he fights this he goes to fight this Gracie in the Rumble on the Rock, and he basically tries to keep the fight as much as possible out of just being a jiu-jitsu fight, not wanting to give the Gracie the one opportunity that he really has to win. It's Rodrigo Gracie, and so they go the full distance of the fight, and it's really not extremely eventful or anything. BJ wins by judgment, but he's not really happy that he hasn't put on a great show in Hawaii. So Rodrigo Gracie is who he fought that time. Meanwhile, all this stuff is going on with the UFC, where they basically take his belt, take his title, and they say, you know, because he's doing these other fights now, he's not in the UFC, then he doesn't get to have their title. And again, that's kind of screwy, because it's supposed to be the world champion title, and he was the one that won it. He should be able to carry that title until he gets another fight from someone in the UFC that can take it away from him, you know, legitimately. But through the courts, the UFC takes it away, and they schedule a fight between Matt Hughes and George St. Pierre for that welterweight championship, and their all-American wrestler boy, Matt Hughes, wins his title back. But he never beat B.J. Penn to do it, and so, you know, really, it's pretty bogus. Meanwhile, B.J. gets set up in K1 again, this time to fight Lyoto Machida. And Lyoto Machida is... Oh, by the way, I should say that Rodrigo Gracie was a middleweight fighter, and so they basically fought at middleweight. So B.J. Penn fought at lightweight, and then he got the welterweight championship, and then he's fighting middleweight with the Gracie, and then he goes to fight Machida. Machida is basically a heavyweight, and I think he says that Machida weighs in at like 225 for their fight, and he weighs in at like 180 himself. So he's going to fight a heavyweight, and their fight goes the distance as well, but the judgment is unanimous for Machida in the end, and BJ admits, you know, that it really should have been that way. It wasn't his. He gassed out, and the decisive round really was Machida's. So this is what Chapter 12 is about, and you know, those are the basic play-by-plays of it. But the reflections that I have on it are really, you know, the kind of the person that B.J. Penn is. He really does not let himself get pushed around. He's really into his development. He wants to develop as a fighter, and he wants to develop as a businessman, and he's not going to let people, you know, try to box him in so that his development is stunted in either way. And that's completely, you know, that's something that I find probably one of the most, you know, aside from that he's just have a crazy natural talent, this is the aspect of B.J. Penn that I find most inspiring, is that he was not going to let anybody impede him in his development, and that meant he would be willing to move around, to face the kind of stress that comes with shifting around in relationships and shifting around in, you know, in organizations and this kind of a thing, if he had to. I mean, not that he wanted to make these big shifts, but he wanted to fight whoever he needed to fight next, no matter where that person was or what organization that person was affiliated with. If there was someone for him to beat that would take him to the next level, that's who he wanted to fight. And he wasn't going to let anybody stand in his way of doing that. At the same time, he wasn't going to be disrespected financially in, you know, his business, because, and this I think, you know, of course I think he gets from his father's probably very smart advice at the time. I wish there was more in here about the direct influence of his father on his business decisions, because I'm quite sure his father played a big role. You know, both his mom and dad's families are entrepreneurs, and so BJ grew up with that. But I know that his family played a big part in his business as a fighter, and so I would have liked to hear more about that, because I don't think these were, you know, solely BJ's decisions. but at the same time there were the smart decisions to be making, which is that, if somebody's going to try to hold you down, even if they're your friend, at that point, at that time, with what they're doing, that's not very friendly. And so you have to fight that, and he does every step of the way. He doesn't let himself get pulled back from reaching his potential as a businessman or as a fighter. And a lot of us, simply because of the social taboo of standing up for ourselves against people who are basically our friends, but for one reason or another trying to hold us back, a lot of us would let ourselves get taken advantage of, I think. And BJ is not about to do that. I don't like litigious people, and I get a little bit of a sense of his litigiousness, but at the same time, he's always forced into that. It's not something that he seeks out, just to make these negotiations difficult. He tries to handle it other ways, and the UFC is obviously trying to get the better end of the card. They're obviously practicing negative reciprocity with him, which is not friendly, and so he does what he has to do, and that is respectable. So those are my notes for chapter 12. On to 13.